as a historian, you have limitations. I couldn't find a written record of her describing it, but I did get oral histories, and apparently she would grow nauseous even at the mention of his name, and was obviously deeply haunted. And I would ask,
Whoa.
yeah,
First of all, there's another movie here that was missed out on, which is I'm thinking of some movies that I've seen before where it's someone way later going to investigate something and piece together what it is, but you were kind of living a movie here because you're digging up this old case and people are coming to you, an author, looking to write a book here and saying, wait, there's a lot more. Since you're working on it, take a look at this. And I can see, you talk about how we describe things in books, but I can see the movie in my head of just like you looking through all the stuff and then telling the story of what you're seeing right there. That could be really cool.
yeah, and it's kind of the clapping, and the third part of the book is that kind of the kind of collapsing of the kind of narrative that was passed down, and opening it up into this far more disturbing reality.
Yeah.
Uncle Joe is participating in this stuff and stealing money.
Did you talk to descendants of people who were on the other side of it?
Yes. Both murders and descendants of both murders and the victims.
What was that like?
Well, one of the things you have to understand, and it took me a while to kind of get my brain wrapped around this, is that, these were inheritance schemes. And so to understand them, you had to share in a mineral trust. So those 2,000 or so in the tribal roll were given what was called a head right. It was like a share. And so whatever the collective wealth was brought in that year from royalties and leases, you got your share of those proceeds. A head right, because the Osage didn't want to have a head right stolen the way their land was, so often land was stolen. So a head right could only be inherited. It couldn't be bought or sold. So there wasn't a way for you to come in and steal, through more conventional means, an Osage's oil money. So what they did is they began to marry into these families.
Oh, whoa.
And then they began to systematically plot to kill the person they had married. And sometimes, because children will get a head right too, even the children you may have had with them. Yeah, it's crazy. It's kind of, it is
sick. It's in every way.
It's sick in every which way.
Now you talk about having the idea at the beginning, and you brought this up like an hour ago where you're saying you can have an idea of what you have and you got to let the facts guide you to wherever it's going to land. So in this case, it lands on something that is actually, I think, far more serious based on what you're describing.
Way more serious.
But do you find it, just as a side note real quick, do you find it difficult sometimes as a storyteller, which is what you're doing? You're trying to take nonfiction things and tell the story of what happened. Do you find it difficult sometimes when you may be really digging into a story, maybe for the New Yorker, and you had an idea, oh, this is what happened and this is what it is, and then it turns out to kind of be, I don't know if you want to call it like a dud, but a lot less interesting than it was? Does that make, does the cognitive bias make it difficult to get there?
It's a great question. And you can become wedded. You can have tunnel vision. You can have tunnel vision. Yeah. I write about people with tunnel vision, investigations, whether they be scientific or criminal, where tunnel vision took over and the outcome became really disastrous and so you're cognizant, and we all have those biases. You've been focusing on one thing, you think it's this thing, you've been working on this thing for so long, you've been working it out in your brain, and then you're like, and it could take you a little while. Let's use Killers of the Flower Moon as an example, though. Great. So I remember when this started to settle, I was kind of like, it took me a while because you're trying to assess it, and then you're also just like assessing it practically. You're like, okay, I've spent all this time, thinking this is it, and you're like, okay, I have to kind of rip those outlines, they're getting all ripped up now, and this is a different story, and I've got to start to think about it in new ways. But one of the things which I struggle with is there is a cognitive bias in knowing the answer, both as an investigator and I know for the reader. So I know the reader is going to want answers. And suddenly I was confronted with all these other murders. I told you about Catherine, I told you about Mary Jo Webb, and they're saying, well, can you look into these cases? And I would look into a lot of the cases, and sometimes I might find some evidence that might pinpoint a suspect, but often, there were no proper investigation. The witnesses are dead, the perpetrators are dead.
Yep.
And I don't know. And so for a long time, I was confronted with that. Like, okay, well, I don't know. And how do I convey that? And then I think, and if I were earlier in my career, there's a cognitive bias to seem smarter than you are as a writer, or to seem like you've got godlike omniscience. I know all the answers, and you don't. And so I realized that this story is going to have this kind of gaping hole. And then the more I thought about it, that is part of the story. That is the horror, that these people like Mary Jo Webb and Catherine Redhorn had lived with these unresolved crimes. And so it did take me a while to kind of recollect. And the truth is really powerful. It's just figuring out what it is and how to convey it. But I ended up realize that's the theme of the book. I mean, rather than just be like, oh, let's just kind of pretend like I know the answer. Yeah, I'm not going to be able to know the answers. And there are going to be a lot of crimes as a reader. We're not going to know the full tally. It's open-ended. But imagine these people who have lived with this. It's a little like someone missing in action. You can't in a war. You don't have closure.
Yes.
And to me, that was really one of the horrors, because the perpetrators had erased not only the victims' lives, but in many cases their history. And to me, that was really, but it took me a while to realize, okay, that's what this book.
What do you mean they erased their history?
We don't know how they died. We don't know who was the killer. Was it?
I thought you meant something else.
Sorry. No. They erased their history because they covered up the crimes. They got the bodies in the buried without a proper investigation. Mm-hmm. And they got away. I mean, they got away. With
murder and money.
Murder, money, and I can't. I had always thought my job was when you're doing a story about an injustice, you think, okay, all right, whatever it may be, you're not fixing the injustice in the sense that it's already taken place, people have died or whatnot, but you can at least, in a case like this, identify the names of the perpetrators and make sure everybody knows who the victims were. And in this case, you could identify the victims, but you could not ensure that those perpetrators' names are known to us and can at least be condemned in history. And that's horrible.
Yeah.
That's horrible.
What became of the money? Like, obviously they didn't kill every single Osage person, but Osage Nation member, but what does it look like today? Are a lot of the descendants of the killers living off the money that they were able to get through the head right?
So some still are getting blood money. I mean, there's not as much from a head right now because it's not the same amount of oil being extracted from the land in that area anymore. But there are still descendants of murderers, descendants of guardians who are receiving blood money, which is an outrage. And there's never been a kind of a complete tally, but at least several Osage and the government eventually paid the Osage about $300 million in kind of trust mismanagement, which just had to do not even with the murders, just had to do with general graft.
When was that? When did they do that?
This was, gosh, it's in my book and I should remember this, but it's more than a decade ago when that was resolved.
So way later.
Yeah, way later. But this was just for general mismanagement of Osage resources. But hundreds of millions of dollars were stolen through graft from the Osage, which has never been returned. But I'm glad you asked me the question about what is Osage Nation like today, because when you write about history, you're writing about a particularly traumatic moment, but history doesn't stop. And we often think of history, whatever time period you're writing about, as kind of this frozen moment. And the Osage to this day, they're a really vibrant nation. They have, I think, more than 20,000
Oh, wow.
citizens in the Osage Nation, voting members. They have their own constitution. They have other sources of wealth. They still have some oil money. And as an Osage lawyer told me when I was visiting one time doing my reporting, she said, we were victims of these crimes, but we don't live as victims.
That's a great way to look at it. I mean, it is many years later, and it's nice to see like the silver lining of them having a great community and all that, because you can fall into that trap where it's like, oh fuck, we lost all that horrible injustice at one time, and it kind of becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy if you stay there.
Yeah, and I think there is sometimes a tendency with writers, especially outside these nations, to kind of write about the traumas and see it as kind of a frozen in time. So I'm glad you asked that. And I always think it's really important to emphasize that.
Did you, when you spoke with some of the descendants of people who had verifiably been involved in killing the Osage, did you have any difficult moments where you're like, you do understand you're being paid by blood money or something along those lines?
Yeah. I mean, those were difficult conversations to have. And, some of the descendants of the Guardians were sometimes a little reluctant to talk or wouldn't, but some of the descendants of the killers did talk to me. Some of them expressed real remorse, and said they are aware of what their ancestors had done. One of the things that I lost my track of thought, so when I was talking a little bit about these were inheritance schemes and the interviews, one of the things you have to realize is that the murderers and the victims were often in the same household. So the descendants are often descendants both. And I'll just give you one very powerful visual image of that. When I interviewed Margie Burkhart, who's kind of the central figure in my book and kind of the soul of the book, and is also the central figure in the movie, played by Lily Gladstone. And I interviewed her granddaughter.
Not like her granddaughter.
Her granddaughter.
Whoa.
And when you talk to her granddaughter, you realize how this is still living history. She said to me at one point, I didn't get to grow up with cousins. And you're kind of thinking about that. It's like, yeah, well, because all of her aunts and great aunt, they were all killed. So she that's why she didn't have cousins. But she showed me a photograph. And it was a photograph of a little boy and a little girl. And the little boy was her father. And at that time, in the photograph, he was just a little boy. And I don't know how old he was. Maybe he was 6 or something. And the girl next to him is his sister. So it's Margie, who is the granddaughter of Molly. It's her father. So the son of Margie and the daughter of Margie. And they are standing, each of them beside a figure. And you could tell it's a man. And you look up this photograph and you're going up the man, and you could see they're holding the hands of this man between them. And you go up, and then when you get to the top of the man, who's much taller than the 2 children, the top of the photograph is ripped off. So the head of the person is missing in this photograph. And I kind of knew, I wasn't sure, but I said, who was that? She said, well, that was Molly's husband. That was her grandfather, who was a killer.
Ernest.
That was Ernest.
Hey guys, if you haven't already subscribed, please hit that subscribe button. It's a huge, huge help. Thank you.
And so she said her father, who was just a boy in that photograph, had ripped off the head of his father in the photograph. And she used to refer to her father as Dynamite. He referred to his own father as Dynamite because he was involved in blowing up a house that killed one of Margie's sisters.
That's tragic.
Molly's sisters.
That's so tragic because he was poisoning his wife.
Yeah, he was involved in poisoning.
Right, so. And she almost died from that.
She almost died from that.
And she didn't know he was doing it.
She did not know she was doing that.
Did you, in reading the records, like once he was arrested, because this is who Leonardo DiCaprio played in the film for everyone Ernest, out there. Yeah. But once he was arrested, and I guess she had to come to terms with that her own husband was trying to kill her. Do we have any record of like what her emotional state was with that?
Yeah. I wish there was more. And that's where you go to your kind of, as a historian, you have limitations. I couldn't find a written record of her describing it, but I did get oral histories. And apparently she would grow nauseous even at the mention of his name, and was obviously deeply haunted. And I would ask, it's a kind of betrayal that is it's unfathomable.
Yes.
And I couldn't, even after all those years, ever fully understand what it must have been like for Molly, even interviewing her family members and her descendants, to realize that the person you thought you loved, the person you married, the person you thought loved you, the person you had children with, is trying to kill you, has killed your mother, killed your sisters, your siblings. I mean, because they were inheritance schemes, they involved a level of intimate betrayal.
You say unfathomable. I think that's a perfect way to put it.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just like, you wonder if someone like that is truly just evil in their heart. I mean, there has to be a level of evil in there, first of all. But you wonder if it's just that, or if there is also a complete, genuine, willful blindness to what they're doing because they're so focused on the bullshit, which is, oh, let me get more money.
Yeah.
Thank you guys for checking out this clip. If you haven't already subscribed, please subscribe and hit the like button on this video. It is a huge, huge help. And if you'd like to check out this clip's full podcast episode, that link is in the description below or right here. And finally, you can follow me on Instagram and X by using the links in my description below.